I'm going to share my screen. Welcome, everybody. Today's topic is, what is the simplified provisions? What are the limited provisions that are included and excluded if that's the option that you check? So let me just show you how we get to this option, then we'll go over sort of what the effect of that is. So if I'm in any client and I'm generating their will, and it's there's the option here for simplified provisions. So what happens if I click on the simplified provisions? That's what we're going to talk about. The reason we built this is we got some feedback from people who said, look, Jordy, your will is way too long. It contains a whole bunch of provisions that my clients don't want, or I don't want, and I want, for a simple situation, I don't necessarily want all of those provisions in there. So what we did is we gave the option to just exclude a whole bunch. That's really what it does. It excludes a whole bunch of definitions and other provisions that probably are not, well, are generally in a very simple situation, not crucial. I prefer to use them, but I can understand why people don't. So that's the idea. And when you generate the will, if you click that off, you're going to generate a will with a bunch of provisions that aren't included. And I want to go through which ones are not included so that you can make the decision about when to check that off and when not. And all of this, by the way, is, you can see this document that I'm going to show you right now is something called Major Differences between the limited provisions, the simplified provisions, and the regular will. So these are, as I said, are basically excluding a whole bunch of provisions. And so let's just run through them. So, the first thing it excludes, and you can always refer back to this to see what you want to do, but things like choice of law, it excludes that. It excludes, a general cover-all, any reference apply that says my trustees also applies to executors, et cetera. Not crucial, probably. And, my trustee, if it's a single person, also applies to substituted attorney or trustees, et cetera. What's meant by a beneficiary? A beneficiary is a person entitled to a benefit under this will. It's, again, not crucial. It excludes the disclaimer. So there's a bit of discrepancy about what happens to a benefit, a gift that's disclaimed. So we have a standard clause here, paragraph C, that says that what happens to such a disclaimed gift. And but again, you can choose not to include that if you're going with the simplified provisions. We don't have to define what is an incapable beneficiary, or we don't define, we delete that definition. We delete the definition that just says, look, if you divide, anytime we say divided into a certain number of parts, we also mean, it's really to avoid an error. You shouldn't ever need this because eState does this automatically and doesn't make a mistake on this. But sometimes I've seen people who say divide my estate into as many shares or into 50 shares, et cetera, but never actually disposes of those shares. So this just says whenever we say to divide it, we also mean to transfer it. This is the even hand rule. So, I personally would like to include that. In most cases where there's a trust, but there are many wills that are drafted where there's no trust at all, everything to the children, and you don't have any sort of, provision for trust, then we don't probably need that. Definition of benefit. We have this definition of benefit that's kind of broad, so we don't have to keep repeating for the support, health, education, maintenance, et cetera. We just use the word benefit. But so it deletes that reference or that definition. These are all just definitions. Unable or unwilling, so deletes that definition. Deletes the definition of reference. When we talk about an act, it also applies to any amendments. Again, most of these I think would apply in any case, or at least that one would. But we include it because it's, just for safe purposes. Then we've got this definition of per serpes. We delete that completely if you're using the simplified provisions, and rely on sort of the common law definition and hope that there's no dispute. it gets rid of this idea of excluding children born out of wedlock or not, or any of that. Just the default is that children born to a person, biological children, always are included. And that's what this, by deleting it, that's the effect of that. So those are the definitions that are deleted and not included if you use the simplified provisions. Okay. Now, I'm sure someone's going to ask, well, what happens if I want some of them, but I don't want all of them, or those kinds of things. So we are going to build support for that, basically, where you're going to be able to pick whatever definitions you want to include in the simplified provisions, and you'll basically set your own. But that's not there yet. That hopefully will be in the fall. So right now you have a choice, either include them all or exclude all of these. Any questions on the definitions that we just ran through? I don't know if mute is on or not, but Mikhail, do you have a spot where, do you have the link to, or where I can find on help desk that just this document so I can send it over to people?
Sure, I'll Slack it to you.
Thanks. Or maybe just tell me and I'll just...
if you just go right to the help desk, you can search it and you'll be able to see it.
So I search for?
Simplified single will.
So here, what are the major differences? So right here, and if you click on this button here, this basically what I've just shown you pops up on the screen. So here it is again. Thanks, Michaela. Those are the definitions that are excluded. The next section are administrative provisions that are excluded. And these are ones that I view as not crucial in a sort of simplified situation. So, you know, the power to purchase assets is deleted. The power to borrow, the power to lend is deleted. The power to deal with securities, again, sort of relying on just the general powers of an executor to deal with those, and not worrying too much about specifically giving those powers. The idea that you can run a business, again, if somebody's got a business interest, you shouldn't be using simplified provisions. Simplified provisions really are for everything to the spouse, everything to adult children, that's it. And in that case, if you want a very simple short will, then that's what you do, but it would exclude these other things. So to lease real estate, you know, if there's corporate interests, you probably don't want to use simplified provisions. If you're going to have investment counsel that you want to hire, you're not going to use the simplified provisions because it deletes that power. Appointing people in other jurisdictions, it's going to delete those powers. Deleting the power to buy errors and omissions insurance for the executor. Indemnifications, those are all excluded. The reference to a GRE. Now, it doesn't mean it's not going to be a GRE. It's going to be a graduated rate of estate, regardless of what we say in the will. It's just, this is just a heads up that we include generally, a heads up that this could be a GRE. And so executor get advice on how long you should hold things and those kinds of things, make elections, et cetera. This is just taking out that sort of reminder clause. So those are the administrative powers that are deleted. And again, you know, you can decide on what situations you would use. You'd be happy with deleting all of these powers. Any questions on that front? And we can open up the floor in a moment as well, so you don't have to rush to questions right now. And then the last, there's a couple of other provisions that are excluded, and that's really just the replacement of trustees. So I historically didn't, when I was, you know, probably 10 years ago, I never included this replacement of trustees provision, just figuring, well, if there's no trustee left, then the court is going to have to appoint. But you know, about 10 years ago, I developed this and basically saying, you know, this is the clause that's in our standard will that says, if the last trustee is acting and doesn't want to act anymore or dies or becomes disabled, this is how a new one gets appointed without having to go to court. So that's what we've got built into the usual will, but it's deleted in the simplified provisions. So, and those are the differences between choosing the simplified provisions or not. And so if I generated now just using with that checked off, this would be the will, and I have no idea how complicated a will this is, but it can generate it in about 8. Your will would be about 8 pages, I think. I hope everybody loves the speed at which these things are getting generated nowadays. I know I'm enjoying that. But so it's still going to include, if we included the funds in the registered asset designation, it's still going to include those clauses. Those are optional. But what's deleted, of course, are all those definitions. So you can see the definition section is quite a bit shorter. It's down to half a page or 3/4 of a page. And it really is only going to put in the clauses that are required for the purposes of the will. So for example, if you gave a gift to siblings, it would, even in simplified provisions, define siblings because we want to know who we're talking about. If you had picked a gift for indexing, that you said, oh, I want $10,000 to go to John, but I want it indexed so it goes up in value over the years. Well, the definition of indexing would be included if that option was checked off. So it's still going to include what I believe to be the required clauses based on what you're doing. It's just deleting those other sort of standard clauses that are not impacted by beneficiaries, et cetera. So yeah, so this is the simplified provisions. It's a little bit complicated. I can see this will is a little complicated, but the clauses, the administrative clauses, are limited as I described. For example, though, it still will put in, if there's a charitable gift, it's still going to include the charitable gift provision. So it's not going to, it's going to include those ones. It's only the ones that I've shown you that are excluded. So does that make sense? So, and there's a question on there and I'll address it in a moment. So that's sort of what happens with these, with the simplified provision. Note as well, right, I say this every time, it's a good reminder that you always have to update the codes when you're finished, and it'll put the right page numbering in, et cetera. So that's that. I'm not going to save that, but what I'm going to just show you, for those of you, let me just ask a question. How many of you prefer that sort of simplified provision for your less complicated wills? Anybody want to jump in and tell me what? I'm just going to clear these and see. Anybody have any comments? Have anybody used it? Are you thinking of using it? What would you want to see? That kind of stuff. Any feedback on that?
Definitely makes sense for some of my simpler situations. For instance, an elderly client with very few assets. Right.
Yeah. And so that's what we built it for. And you don't want to, do a whole complicated situation. And here's sort of the only time I would use it is, and I'd get rid of these kinds of things and I'd just go generate, because I wouldn't necessarily want to deal with, have a joint asset confirmation. I probably wouldn't need one, because everything in this kind of situation would be likely just going to the spouse. Anybody else have situations where they've used it, or anything else that people suggest that we remove from the simplified provisions, Will?
I have a client who's separated and wants to leave everything equally to 4 children.
So this one's
no
10
major
pages,
assets.
but there's a charitable gift and things, so that's why it's a little bit longer. Anybody? All right. Jordy, what's the best way to gift private company shares, in this case to the spouse? Client doesn't want a secondary gift. So let's just take a situation where you're in the surviving spouse scenario because they want to give it to the spouse. So, I mean, I presume that assumes the spouse is not getting the residue. Because if the spouse is getting the residue, then you wouldn't need to make a specific gift of the private company shares. But if you were just, let's say the residue was going to some other, party, then let me just do an example. I'll just edit this. So let's say it's going to John Collins, the residue, but I want the spouse to get the private company shares. Then I would just simply drag the private company shares in, name the beneficiary as Lauren with no gift over, if that's the case. They don't want a secondary gift. And that's all that you do. I wanted to address, other questions, and we have a few minutes still, but I'd love to hear if anybody has other questions on the simplified provisions, on using it, on any suggestions, on any trouble spots, those kinds of things. Just a heads up on what we're doing in the next month and a bit. We're working on a new, and I think I mentioned this, basically the interface is going to be updated, and we're adding some additional options in there. The biggest of which is the ability to gift over, in this particular relevant where there's no descendants, gift over to basically anybody you want. So you'll make a gift and then to John, and then if John's not alive, then you can make a different gift to different people, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that I know people have been asking us for, and we're working on that. Other things that we're working on, and I'm not promising a date yet, but it's being part of this, is the ability to give away a specific asset in different, not equally. So to multiple people, but not equally. So I want to give my private company shares to 2 people. Right now, all you can do is give it to them equally. So it just says, give my private company shares to Lauren and Lily equally. We're building an ability to divide that in some unequal fashion. It's fairly complicated, believe it or not, but that's what we're building, and we're going to build the ability to also direct the sale. So you've got a home. Well, I want you to sell this home, take the proceeds, and now split that in unequally among a bunch of people. So we're building that as well. So that's on our short-term pipeline list. So it's. I preface that. I should have prefaced that. I love when people tell me, yeah, they say the whole thing and then they say I preface that. That's not correct. This is a condition subsequent. That giving away specific assets should only be resorted to after a thorough discussion with the client about the drawbacks of specific asset gifts. We get a lot of inquiries from lawyers who want to say, okay, so how do I give away this specific account or this investment account to 5 different people or 3 different people or 2 different people or 1 person? And so we can't do it unequally yet. But one of the things I would always caution people on, when a client says to me, oh, I want to give this account to this person, that account to that person, red flag should shoot up. Because go back to sort of the reality that the will is probably not going to kick in for some period of time. It is highly improbable that the value of that asset will be the same as it is now. It may be completely different. It may not exist. So that asset would deem, and then you got a problem. So it doesn't exist anymore. That beneficiary gets nothing. Or, for example, investment accounts. You might, at the end of your life, decide, I'm going to move all my bank accounts into this one investment account and not leave any residue. And now the beneficiaries of that investment account are getting the entire estate and everybody else is getting nothing. It's highly inflexible. That is the problem with specific asset gifts. Unless there's a great reason to give a certain asset to a certain person, private company shares may be that exception. A cottage might be that exception. But typically, if I say to people, look, you're giving this one investment account to this one person, do you realize that all kinds of things could change? Why not pick a number and give them that? Unless there's a really good reason, and we can index it and we can do all kinds of things. But giving away a specific asset is typically not a great solution unless there's no other alternative. So, and I did an article at one point on on this because they seem simple to a client. It seems like the simplest thing. I want to give this bank account to this person, that bank account to that person. I want this house to go to that person. Don't also forget about the income tax implications of a gift of a specific asset, especially if it's gone up in value. It's going to trigger capital gains that the residue is going to pay unless we build in conditions. So there's really, from a client point of view, sounds great. And that's why people go and do their own will, and God bless them. Let them go do their own will. But they're missing out a key component of advice. And that advice is like, this is a bad strategy. And that's where we as lawyers can add value, because there's a whole groundswell of people going to start doing their own wills online. It's going to actually, for sure, if we don't keep up, cut into our business. So, but this is one area where people who don't know what they're doing don't know what they're doing. So I hope that was a little editorializing, but I just, as a practice matter, I just would hesitate whenever somebody says that's a C if there's not another alternative. Opening up the floor. Anybody have any feedback, suggestions for improvements, problems that they're having, issues with why are they, we asked last week, is there a reason that's holding you back from using estate planner in every one of your files? If you're not, what can we do to improve that? And there's the questionnaire we're working on to make that better for clients. So if anybody has a few minutes that I want to share, if there are no other questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Jordy, one of the things that I'm kind of struggling with, I guess, a little bit is...
So I don't know if you're speaking, but if you are, it's muted.
Oh,
never mind.
Am I good now?
Anybody?
Yeah, we can hear her, Jordy.
Jordy, can you hear me?
Apparently not.
Any general questions? Anything that we can help with?
Maybe type in the chat box.
Okay.
We're talking. I don't hear anybody.
That's so weird.
Somebody say something.
I don't think it's helping if we
there
say
we
something.
go.
Oh,
Okay.
Do you hear us now?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Hello?
Okay.
Even when this happens to my clients, I still continue to charge my hourly rate, even though I can't hear them. So go ahead, guys. Sorry, I missed everything anybody said.
I guess I was just wondering, in the no descendants scenario where people are leaving assets, the residue essentially, and they're breaking up between siblings and whatever, why is there not a way that we can specify that as a condition of those gifts, they have to pay the estate and income taxes, if any, arise?
Because it comes out from, sorry, as a percentage you'd pay the, because if it's residue, that would come off the top.
Because of those clauses in the will that are automatically there that just say, I direct my trustees to pay the estate taxes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the residue always is a net amount. So what happens is always the debts come off the top of the residue. And that's why you don't need to apportion them. They're already, by definition, apportioned by percentages. It's only when you give a specific asset to a specific person, they're going to get that asset, and the tax by default is going to come out of the residue.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
The other thing that I was wondering is when you have, this came up in a help that I submitted to Michaela this week, and I think she spoke to you about it, but when we have people who have minor children and they have assets, registered assets, such as RRSPs and RESPs and TFSAs, et cetera,
yeah.
If they want to have the kids as contingent beneficiaries of those plans, there's not a way if you put them in the registered or designated asset to make it a trust.
Right, because, well, there's a couple of reasons. So let's just talk about RSP trusts and minors beneficiaries. RSPs are tricky for young kids, because most often, if it's a very significant amount, let's say, take this scenario where an RSP is a very significant amount and they have trust for their kids anyway, they're minors. They probably don't want those RSP assets to go to those kids at 18, which is what would happen unless they really formed part of the estate, okay? A simple designation of the beneficiaries so you can name minors as beneficiaries of registered plans, but what happens is that you have to buy an annuity with that. There's a rollover, you have to buy an annuity with that, and it gets paid out until they're 18. And then they get it all. So it's a really not a great way of planning for large amounts. And so what you're, I think, trying to do is have your cake and eat it too. We don't want probate tax on the RSP, but we want the trust provisions that apply to the residue. And arguably you can do that, although there's some concern about, because it doesn't specifically allow you to appoint a trustee in the Succession Law Reform Act. My personal preference, is unless we're talking about $1 million or more, I'm going to have that RSP flow through the estate and have the trust provisions that are in the residue for the minors apply to those proceeds. It's actually, that's a cheap price to pay, the 15 grand, than trying to name minors as beneficiaries or even a trustee as a beneficiary of the RSPs. So that's my preference. We will consider drafting an RSP trust for larger ones and give you the option to do that if you want, with appointing basically the executor to receive those RSPs and then deal with it on the same terms as the residue, almost like the way our insurance designation works. So if there's support from that for that, Sarah, then that we can sort of I'll put on our list.
So you would also not recommend to put it under initial gifts and make it a trust? No.
Okay. No, I mean, because you don't well, unless you don't want them to get it as, it's different than the residue. Like, I wouldn't do it. The only time I use initial gifts is if I want something to go in some way other than what the residue is. So in that case, I wouldn't do it, because then you not only not get the probate avoidance benefit because it's not a designation, but then you're sort of confusing that asset with other assets, and there's huge tax implications on those assets as opposed to the other typical assets. So I wouldn't do that.
Okay. And do you say the same about insurance policies when they're being left to minors?
So let me explain that. So if we have an insurance policy, because this is important to just understand how, and before I get to this, I just want to mention something that's something we have new for everyone. We now have an annotated will. So if you're not comfortable yet with what our will does, so you're not sure exactly what everything is doing, we have this. I did this annotated will. So I sort of take you through every provision of the template. And if you type in annotated single will, there's a video. It's a half an hour. It'll be a worthwhile half an hour. And basically I take you through every clause and tell you why it's in there, how it got generated, what did I put in, in the portal to generate that clause, things like that. So it's under annotated single will in the help desk area support. So let me just go back for a second to the life insurance. So let's take the scenario where I want to leave the life insurance to the kids, right? But I want it basically on the same trust as the residue because I don't want them getting the money. So if I just drag, first of all, I don't necessarily have to do anything. That's the first thing. Because I'll show you why. If I don't do anything with the life insurance, there's going to be, and I generate the life insurance declaration, there's going to be a provision that says, what I want you to do with the life insurance is pay it to the trustee as a separate trust. So in other words, it's outside of the estate, so it avoids probate tax, presumably. And sorry, and deal with those proceeds, I'll just blow this up, as a separate insurance trust on the same terms as the residue of my estate. So that's how it gets done. It automatically gets done that way. And so if you're doing that, you can simply just generate the life insurance designation, and that will go to the kids, but separately, and avoid probate tax. So I hope that, and I think there may be a video up there about insurance declarations and how those work. That's how we can avoid, that's how you can have your cake and eat it too. And an RSP designation would be a similar type provision.
Okay, thanks very much, Jordy.
Sure. So I want to just wrap up for today because I like to keep it to a half hour. Happy to spend a couple of more minutes if anybody has questions. Again, please feedback, questions or whatever. And if you have the time to listen, I suggest you can also listen to it at double speed. That's what I do. You can listen to it in 15 minutes and then slow it down at the parts you want. But it's really a good refresher on sort of, okay, why does it generate with a city name, and why does this clause come up, and those kinds of things. So it's called the Annotated Will. Thank you all, and I'm here if anybody has any questions.
Jordy,
Yeah.
did we have that final clause that says that if anyone challenges the will, that they lose their normal entitlement?
So that gets automatically generated if it notices that you're treating your children differently. So we'll build in the option that you can actually select that. But right now, what happens? So if I give one kid more money than the other, it's going to know to put that clause in automatically. But you're right. There are probably other situations, and so we'll probably put that as an option that you can check off if you want to include that.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah.
Jordy?
Yeah.
Can you just show us again how to to format it so it always keeps your address at the bottom and your name and the witnesses?
For the witnesses? Sure.
And,
yeah. So the first thing is you can set your defaults. So first of all, the users, you can put, so for witnesses, they have to be a user. So you can put their address in there. And then for the documents, for the will, you can select those default witnesses. So as a default, I want Jordan first and then Thomas as the other witness. Okay. Now I save it. Now when I go to a client and I generate their will, so I generate the single will. So
you're not sharing your screen right now, Jordan.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So let me just, go back for a second. I've set my defaults let me go here, and in the documents, I can set my default witnesses. So default witnesses, I want Jordan first, and then I want Thomas as the second witness, or I always want it to be blank first, and then Thomas as the second witness. The idea is that the default witnesses have to be a user in your portal. So those are the default, but then when I go to generate any document, I can override those. So I go to the document, I generate a single will, and up come the default witnesses. But in this case, Thomas isn't around, so I want demo to be the other witness. I can change that. Now, when I include, it'll include the witness's name and occupation in the document itself. That's how it's done. So the key there is that it has to be a user, and we are coming to we're talking about how to deal with that, but that's how it's set up. And so if you go to the end of it, you'll see that this has the populated address and occupation. Did that, Erin, answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Jordy, in this example, you've got an also known as, but it's not showing up in the signature line.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in the signature line typically.
Oh,
people
okay.
Want that? Yeah, I don't put that. I don't usually put that in the signature line. It's just identifying the client at the top that's where you need that.
Jordy, another question.
Yeah.
Do you use wallpaper yourself?
I used to, then I stopped, and I don't use wallpaper anymore.
And do you find your clients still want wallpaper or no?
No, nobody's ever asked me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And it's a pain. I used to use POA, like wallpaper for POAs, and it was to print the final version, and then you needed a different, it was just too much of a pain for me. Nobody's ever questioned it. Just Mark, because you raised the AKA. So remember that if you want this to say Benny Collins, then that's what you have to put in the AKA, right? In this case, the AKA, and I'll just show you where that was. And this is in the annotated will, by the way. I explain how this works, but it's going to just put in whatever you've put in the also known as. So if you want Benny Collins in there, then you got to put in also known as Benny Collins, okay? And then it'll generate the document with the Benny Collins name in there. Other questions? Oops, I think I missed it. Yeah, so there you go. And we are going to get to the point, the other big part of this release in early September is we're going to get to the point where you're going to be able to tell us, we'll have to do it internally, but if you want specific clauses, you want, we're going to customize, we'll be able to customize your templates, especially for the users, you guys who are, who joined us early and are users. We'll be happy to work with you on customizing templates for you. And right now that's not possible using these componentized ones, but that's something we're going to be offering people. So know that's coming down the pike in a much more useful way than the old version where you had to sort of edit it and could limit what you could edit. So, and eventually we're going to leave that to you. So you're going to be able to create your own templates and put in your own logic and things like that, and your own questions in the portal. So that's a little bit a ways. Great. Well, as you know, we're always here. So let us know if we can help, and check out the annotated will, and happy to have you along. And yeah, thanks so much,
Thanks
everybody.
a lot, Jordy and team.
Thank you.
Happy to stay on. If anybody has questions that they didn't get to, you can pipe up now.
Thank you very much.